care about current affairs, it's on the OShow.
Welcome to the OShow, Canada's current affairs show with strong opinions. I'm your host, Laura Babcock. And before we get started with an epic show, I want to thank all of you across Canada and around the world who are listening to this podcast, who are watching it, who are sharing it and subscribing to it and giving our clips hundreds of thousands of views, because there couldn't be a more important time for our country and frankly for the world. And so today I'm so thrilled to have back on the program someone whose leadership, both across Canada and globally, is widely respected. And when she speaks, her comments go viral. I'm talking, of course, about Elizabeth May. She is the leader of the Green Party of Canada. She has been doing this for a while and she knows of what she speaks. And so today we're going to talk about, she said to me, what do we want to talk about, Laura? I said, everything, all of it, all at once, all the things. So welcome to the OShow, Elizabeth May.
Thank you. And a teeny correction, because we made the big transition, global Greens all around the world. There are a lot of countries, because we're 80 countries around the world with Green parties, and about a third of them have co-leaders instead of single leaders. So I'm co-leading with Jonathan Pedneau, who's a brilliant young Quebecer and is running in Outremont. And so our co-leadership, this will be the first time I've gone into a national election campaign with a co-leader, and I'm really excited about that change.
Yeah, that is big. And thank you for letting me know. I missed that amongst the maelstrom of what is going on. But to your point, we have a federal election writ that is about to be dropped in Canada coming up in just a couple of days. So we're getting Elizabeth right before the election officially kicks off. I saw you post about this, the fact that some of our Canadian major media is owned by U.S. hedge funds. And so we're coming into a federal election. The stakes could not be higher for our democracy as we're staring down the barrel of the Trump tariffs and all the other crazy stuff happening with our neighbor. And we have foreign ownership of our media. But we also have a Canadian broadcaster, and one of their hosts, Rosemary Barton, got into an exchange during Prime Minister Mark Carney's overseas trip this past week, where she challenged him on an answer, but she positioned it in a way that I certainly, as a former television journalist, full disclosure, I was one for CBC back in the day. I thought the way she posed her question was wrong. There was backlash in the moment from Mark Carney. And then I guess in some sort of format of damage control, she posted on X, "I hope all the conservatives tweeting about me and my tough questions finally agree to appear on my program. They have an open invitation, #journalism." Why did you see that as the leader, now co-leader of the Greens, to respond to her, since it wasn't directly you who were in that conversation? You're not conservative. Why did you respond, and what was the purpose of the point you were making?
Yeah, let me say, first of all, that I always loved Paul Martin, and one of the things he wrote in his autobiography was that a politician who complains about the media is like a sailor who complains about the sea. I mean, I'm not going to ever complain about the media, which is why I kept this to myself since 2015. And when I was appearing on Rosemary Barton's show, when it was Power and Politics, I was wrong to interrupt her. She wasn't letting me finish the sentence, and she was essentially ridiculing Stéphane Dion, who was at that point both our former environment minister, a former president of the climate negotiations that had happened in 2005, and therefore respected globally. And he was one of the people going into the Paris negotiations that happened right after the 2015 election, critical negotiations for the planet. And I was on a multi-MP panel. And in any case, I kept it to myself. But she said when the show was over, "You're never again on my show," not CBC's national broadcast for people interested in public affairs. And in fact, I was only allowed on Power and Politics when there was a guest host. She never had me on again. And so I think that crosses a line. I felt that that's why when she said people are invited back on my show. Now, sure, she invited conservatives. She didn't say conservatives and Greens, you're all welcome back on my show. But I thought this is an opening to say, yes, it was 9 years ago, but the most knowledgeable MP in Parliament on climate, well, let me be more modest and say among the top 10 most knowledgeable MPs in Parliament about climate would include me. And the idea that I wasn't going to be allowed on Power and Politics again because I defended Rosemary Barton by insisting on finishing an answer. I think to me, it suggests that, I think I wasn't defending Mark Carney. I'm not taking sides on that one. I don't think people in politics should criticize journalists,
Right.
but I don't think journalists should have a kind of diva attitude that it's their show, their personal
Yeah.
opportunity
Yeah.
for people to express their views to Canadians, particularly on our national public broadcaster. So maybe I shouldn't have said anything, Laura. I don't know. You're the first person to ask me about it since I put that out on that horrible
Well,
Twitter platform.
it has had hundreds of, I captured the exchange between you and Rosemary, and I put it on Threads and on Blue Sky, and I can't keep up with the responses to it. So I'm
Well, see, I'm still out of the loop. I may go viral, but I miss it.
Well,
Sorry.
no, that's, I knew you were coming. I told people you were going to be on the program soon, so we talk about it. So I'm glad you clarified that it wasn't because she somehow denies climate science or because of
No,
because that was some of the concern, right? People thought, oh, is she not invited back because because you mentioned climate in your post with Rosemary.
well, that was the reason that I tried to finish my answer.
Okay.
She was dismissive and uh, dismissive not just of Stéphane Dion as a person in politics,
Mhm.
but dismissive of what he said and the significance of the negotiations. She essentially was ridiculing the advice of scientists that Stéphane Dion was articulating.
Okay.
And what I tried to say was, look, this rises above partisanship. And I remember Nathan Cullen was on the panel with me. And look, this is much more important than where we stand on politics. What Stéphane Dion is saying is not what you're saying, he said.
Okay.
He's not saying there's no point in the negotiations.
Gotcha.
He's saying that if all we try to do is the minimum, it will not be enough to protect this biosphere and human civilization
Mhm.
from an untimely end. I'm very and since then things have only gotten worse. And the coverage, and I won't single out any broadcaster, but coverage around climate science has declined since then.
Yeah.
We don't have, we have a few. We have Laura Lynch on What on Earth on CBC Radio, but we don't have the same level of basic climate discussion, and we end up having the domination of the discussion, which you can't call a discussion, being three-word slogans, and the conservative benches yelling "axe the tax." And to my horror, people who should know better, like Jagmeet Singh, and now Mark Carney,
Mhm.
running for cover because axe the tax is what? Not too much to deal with? That you talk about a three-word slogan that rhymes, defeats mountains of economic analysis. It's very, very concerning. But to me, it goes back to in that moment, what I was trying to do was explain climate science. And and for making the effort to try to explain, and it was, as you've seen from the clip, it the dismissiveness was hard, and I insisted on finishing the sentence.
Mhm.
That was about climate science. And for doing that, I was punished and not allowed on the show again as long as Rosemary was in the chair.
So has Rosemary Barton responded to your comment on X directly? Have you had an apology or any kind of an approachement or anything?
I don't expect one, and I probably made things worse by pointing out that I was blackballed from the show from then on, unless it was a guest host. So David Cochran has me back on. I hope he doesn't have any more difficulty now. And one of the reasons I also felt I'm co-leader,
Mhm.
and within the Green Party, and it was the Greens in Germany and their co-leaders who've made this precedent that in roles during a writ period
Mhm.
where only one person can take that position. So
Right.
the German Greens in the election that happened in, gosh, now it was the one where Scholz's government
Mhm.
coalition was formed. The co-leaders were Annalena Baerbock, who's still she's now out of the coalition, but she was the German foreign minister, and Robert Habeck, who was Minister of Economy. They were the two Green co-leaders in Germany. And only one name could go on the ballot to be chancellor. And so it was a mutual decision by consensus approved by the party in Germany that it be Annalena Baerbock. So Jonathan Pedno and I have had the same
Mhm.
discussion, and our federal council, which governs the party, has confirmed that for the leadership debates, we certainly couldn't expect that the networks would say, you can pick and choose. And Elizabeth being maternal language Anglophone, she can do the English debates, and Jonathan Pedno being a Quebecer, we would never, that would be a horrifying, we would never wash. So we'd already made the decision. And in certain elections, Canada documents do not anticipate co-leaders. So we've made that transition. We're still co-leaders. We will still we're doing the launch together on Sunday morning in Montreal, in Outremont, in Jonathan's home riding. But I think the media I think the interviews during the election campaign, the one-on-one, where usually it used to be Peter Mansbridge and then it's been Rosemary Barton. And she certainly let me do those in the past when I was leader. I imagine this time it will be with Jonathan Pedno. So I hope I haven't made things worse in terms of our relationships. I respect her as a journalist, but I still think it was quite shocking to take the person who's really, I'm not going to use, I'm not going to say most knowledgeable, but certainly I've been to more conferences with the parties and been involved in climate science and negotiations since 1986. And I was on the organizing team for the Government of Canada on the first International Scientific Conference that was the last week of June 1988 in Toronto. So I've been educated by the best scientists in Canada. I'm not a scientist myself, but I'm very more than concerned that as we are distracted by other key concerns like affordability, or for heaven's sakes, like Trump, who's just again withdrawn the United States from the Paris Agreement, when we're dealing with many, many issues, Greens will never take our eye off the ball that we have actual scientific proof and understanding of what we face. Pierre Poilievre may not want to know about it. Some of his members of his caucus understand it for sure. Some Liberals understand it better than others. Some NDPers understand it better than others. The Bloc understands it. We're facing in real life a climate emergency that in my home province of British Columbia, people may not know this in your listening and viewing audience, that in the first day or two of July 2021, 619 British Columbians died in 4 days in the heat dome. I don't think it got reported like that across Canada. We then had the atmospheric rivers that wiped out every land route to the lower mainland. You couldn't reach Vancouver from anywhere in British Columbia unless you went south through the United States and then up, because the infrastructure was destroyed to reach Vancouver by road from the Fraser Canyon or from interior BC. It's astonishing to me. And then, of course, Hurricane Fiona, the loss of life there, the loss of infrastructure, the major forest fires we've experienced. We are experiencing billion-dollar events, one after the other after the other. Heck, the hailstorm that hit Calgary earlier in 2024 was $1 billion loss of insurable losses. But the thing about that heat dome, very few insurable losses, 619 people dying, doesn't hit the ledger sheets of an economy like losing our forests to the pine beetle, or losing infrastructure, things you have to rebuild, things you have insured like your cars. But 619 lives, it's sort of like the heat domes to me are like the neutron bomb of the climate crisis. They kill the people and leave the buildings standing.
That's terrifying, especially because they prey on the most vulnerable, right? Who don't have access to air conditioning, and so
yeah.
There are lots of climate mitigation strategies. There are lots of strategies that governments can do to make it more equitable, to insist that, and I've been fighting for locally in our city, we're in Canada. We need heat in the winter for people, and now we need air conditioning in the summer for people because of the climate.
Laura, one of the things Professor Blair Feltmate, who's at University of Waterloo and studies adaptation, and he told the media at the time, in major extreme weather events, quite often you also lose power. And he said, if the power had gone down in those days, it wouldn't have been hundreds of deaths, it would have been thousands. So again, air conditioning isn't a solution as much as, for instance, having communities prepare in advance to know you've got to stock up on ice. You've got to make sure people have access to shade. The police in Vancouver stopped homeless people from going into the park during the heat dome. They wanted to get under the shelter and the shade of trees. And I mean, we all know it any kind of heat wave. If you can get to a green space and get in shade, the temperature drops substantially versus being on black asphalt and unremitting heat in those heat islands. The police stopped homeless people physically from
Wow.
going into the park for fear they might set up shelters and stay there. So we need to be much better prepared for protecting the most vulnerable. Paramedics need to be prepared, and we need to have cooling. This is one of the things I think the government of British Columbia, by the way, was criminally negligent in failing with temperature predictions that were known several days in advance. They did not declare an emergency. Nobody set up cooling centers. So they left it to small towns that also talk about equity. Many small rural municipalities don't have the same resources. And without the province declaring that this was a state of emergency, there were no cooling shelters. There were no places to go for respite. And the paramedics, I mean, there's still paramedics who have PTSD from the whole experience. It was a terrifying experience, and it will happen again. And I don't think we're any better prepared because the federal adaptation strategy says we need more air conditioning. Okay, good as far as that goes. But what do you do when the power goes out? And one of the things that happens in extreme weather events, and this is one of the things that the Green Party platform wants to prepare people for, and in the same way we say we've got to be prepared for the coming storms of what Trump will bring to us. We want to be prepared for the coming storms of what happens in our economy. We want to be prepared. But one of those things for which we have to be prepared is how do we prepare in advance so that we have kind of a civil defense system so we know how to get people out of harm's way. The two things that happen almost right away is you lose cell service and you lose landlines. So people who've been through forest fires where they're on evacuation alert, how do they know when they're on get out now orders, and how they know which direction to drive? Are they driving towards the fire or away from it?
I'm so glad
In
you
the
brought.
4 people who died in Nova Scotia in May of 2023 in floods, had the system's been working, they would have gotten a warning that said, shelter in place, don't drive. There's flooding happening. We can't. The 4 people who drowned because the authorities knew but had no way to communicate, stay put. So there's a lot of work that for a wealthy industrialized country like Canada, with the sophisticated systems we have, we should be far better prepared for what's coming at us than we are, both in terms of Trump
No,
and in terms of climate.
absolutely. And I want to get into that, but just a last point on this. I'm so glad you brought it up because when the floods happened in Mississauga last year, and people were showing all these videos of like train stations downtown Toronto being flooded. It gets national news when it affects the national news centers, right? And had I not driven through the fires in BC in an RV during the pandemic and seen the helicopters flying and the flames on both sides of the highway with my family, I wouldn't probably wouldn't have such a keen sense of the risk. But I'm glad you brought it up on the OShow because we are watched across the country. And I'm glad that, even as the dominating topic in this election is going to be who can stop Trump, I'm glad that you're bringing up your platform with us here on the OShow. And I've always found that the Greens, I remember when I used to moderate federal debates for cable, the Greens at the end of every debate in their closing for a few years, the move was to pass their policies on to the other candidates and say, whoever wins, please just take our policy manual, right? So it's incredibly important to get these practical things out. And there was an article in the Toronto Star recently, I believe it was the Star, about a civil defense, about starting one in Canada, so that Canadians can volunteer and learn now how to help each other, whether it is a climate crisis or climate storm event, like we're talking about these superstorms, or whether or not it is because of, God forbid, something military that we have to gird ourselves against. So let's just thank you for that. I'll make sure that we put out that there are tips for how we need to prepare ourselves because these storms are going to come. And I agree with you. I don't feel any more prepared. I don't think
No.
any of the things you brought up are being addressed locally that I'm even aware of. And I'll join a civil defense to help with communications. And no, I will. Any of us who can do whatever we can should.
Well, I'm still very touched and moved by the story you mentioned last time I was on with you, that your son said, "Where do I sign up if I'm going to defend my country?" For as I understand it, your son's still a teenager.
Yeah.
For him to be concerned to that degree, I found extremely moving and also inspiring. I'm seeing it much more from Canadians of all ages.
Mhm.
I'm standing on guard for thee. And sure, I'm not going to go on a vacation to the United States. That's a good decision. I'm going to try to buy Canadian as much as I can. I think one of the things we should try to do right now as a you know
Mhm.
punch back at Trump, who doesn't believe in democracy, is instill in every Canadian, it is my patriotic duty to vote. If we
Yes.
had the highest voter turnout that we've ever had in this country, that would be a message. However you're going to
Yeah.
vote,
So both,
high voter turnout sends a message.
my 16-year-old son and my 14-year-old daughter both feel the same way, and are both wish they could vote because what they're watching, and I think just to set the table for our discussion around the other threats beyond climate change, is I was talking to my daughter and describing what was happening in the last 24 hours with the Trump Elon regime
Yeah.
and she says, "Wow, we've seen this before in history." And I said, "Yes, it's absolutely fascism. It's absolutely terrifying." But I realized after we had this discussion, we talked about it, you'd be on the program and all the other things going on that we can do about it here in Canada. I realized that while we might have had these moments in history in the past, they weren't also dealing with climate change and dealing with the climate crisis and dealing with that. So, I mean, for young people out there, just as a note for anyone listening or watching, they are not just dealing with the angst of being young people, all the social media nonsense we didn't deal with, and now the rising fascist threat around the world and very close to our borders. They're also dealing with superstorms and the climate burning. And, so I think it's incredibly important that we educate ourselves, that we have these conversations. And so, Elizabeth, just on the conversation note, you posted just recently on your X feed after your exchange with Rosemary. You post, and I do hope that the CBC follows up with you. I really do. I'm tough on them when they misstep, and the fact that that was ever said to you, I think, is a gross misstep. And you need to be at the table, and I hope that this doesn't do anything at all to make CBC less willing to have you on the table and in the discussion. Because if they look at any of the social media on this, they will know that Canadians very much want your voice there. It's our Canadian broadcaster. CBC is incredibly important.
Well, I
I
always
hope you
say I
continue.
defend CBC even if they don't defend me. The Greens are very committed to a fully funded CBC and
So,
Radio
so am
Canada,
I. Yeah.
English and French, and no commercial broadcasting. There should be no advertising during the journalistic portions, the news portions. We want to bring back the supper time news hours that used to happen with local television stations, more local journalism coverage, because that directly connects, speaking of voter turnout, local information and civic knowledge directly contributes to voter turnout. And another weird one I would never have thought of, except that of all weird things, becoming a member of parliament led me to have greater personal fitness because believe it or not, we had Pierre Lafontaine, the Olympic swim coach for a while, for a couple of years, was doing a weekly swim class with MPs, believe
Cool.
it or not. And Pierre Lafontaine was one who told me, since we lost all those local news channels, engagement for kids in sports has been going down because their parents and grandkids couldn't see the local team on the local CBC affiliate anymore. And so the training up of our kids to be future Olympians, I never would have made that connection that took a hit when CBC cuts meant that they had to shut down so many of the stations and coverage across the country. So we're very committed to protecting CBC. We're probably more committed to protecting it than to Pierre Poilievre is to destroying it.
Well, that's good to hear. And my viewers know I'm married to a lifelong CBC employee, so I have a bias there. But also, having worked there, they do good work. And when they step the wrong step, then I've always called them out. I do think, though, with the Liberals before the election, anyway, still within the Trudeau government, talked about reinvesting in CBC and building up some of those critical resources, not because of a political perspective, but because of what you're talking about, the need for Canadians to have a public broadcaster who is robust. Because as you just posted on X, we have foreign ownership of some of our major media in this country. And when we head into an election where the threats of the US president are driving the ballot question, I'm deeply concerned that Canadians don't even realize that these newspapers that they might be reading or this media they might be consuming is owned by, American interests.
Yeah. And this is what I mean, and I really appreciate it. Linda McQuaig is one where I first saw this in her piece in the Toronto Star. I mean, I knew it, but I hadn't really been thinking about it. Let's face it. I mean, I've been very concerned because Madam Justice Hogue, in her commission report on threats to democracy and foreign interference, said the single biggest threat in Canadian democracy is misinformation and disinformation from our social media, which is owned by guess who? The billionaire henchman of Trump, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. Their ability to distort and manipulate, not to mention Russia Today, which Canadians can still access. I mean, when it was RT and the CRTC had approved it, it was reaching 8 million homes in Canada. So the intrusion, and we know they're not shy to intrude in the democratic processes of other countries. Most of the foreign interference work that we've done in Parliament has focused on India and China and Russia. But we know that the US is also does interference in elections in the past, historically, with coups run by the CIA, but depending on the country. But we're looking at right now, we know Elon Musk got involved in the German election and called on voters in Germany, that the real Germany were the neo-Nazis. It's not a stretch to be worried about. We know the election is going to be called this Sunday, March 23rd. We're either going to be voting April 28th or May 5th. We have more systems in place within Elections Canada than we used to have to raise a red flag on disinformation. But we're nowhere near protected from the massive empire, the social digital media empire that's controlled entirely outside of Canada. And yes, CBC is an important part of pushing back on that. But frankly, all Canadian-owned journalism is. But we've lost so many newspapers. I mean, go back to I think, Laura, do you remember, you're too young, the Tom Kent Commission back in the 70s that looked at the concentration of media ownership in Canada and said it's not dangerous yet, but we're on a dangerous trajectory. And that was before Conrad Black bought up almost everything. And newspapers across Canada, of course, were closed in his cost cutting to save money. But in the meantime, these social media giants have gutted the revenue source for most of our daily newspapers. And without compensation, and for if you haven't thought about this before, we think back to the days when we used to pour through the classified ads to find an apartment for rent or a job opening, or does anyone have a puppy for sale? You had to go, and those classified ads brought in revenue to our daily newspapers. So newspapers have suffered dramatically. Essentially, they've been cannibalized by foreign for-profit pirates. And we now know the political stripe of those pirates, and they are Trumpian. We better be paying a lot of attention to our friends and neighbors. And when someone says something to us that we know is patently absurd, don't be rude about it. Say, wait, where did you get that information? Can you check that against a source that's credible? Because we know from Madam Justice Hogue's commission, which is impartial and nonpartisan, we know from many studies that have been done looking at digital democracy that these guys are a threat and they will want to spin us as voters. They'll want to push us in a certain direction. And we have to be very wide awake to that and protect ourselves by going to a credible source like CBC, Toronto Star, Canadian papers in my community, Victoria Times columnists or the Vancouver Sun. At least they're Canadian papers. I don't always agree with their editorial stance, but we have to. And by the way, I read the Guardian a lot from the UK. We have to find sources that we think are credible and double check and triple check before we share information that could be pro Putin, pro Trump. It's interesting, isn't it, how all the bullies are actually good friends and get along so well. Trump, Putin, Netanyahu, the bunch of them, Bolsonaro.
Yeah. No, it's terrifying. We're watching a realignment of global power. And I just want to push back a little bit on your suggestion around how to process the information. While I agree with you, that is the process that should happen. They have done such a good job with this propaganda war on information of making it so muddy, Elizabeth, that
Yeah.
people don't even trust what used to be pillars of journalism. And this is why, and I'll say this here on the O Show because it's my opinion, I think Rosie should make it some kind of clarifying statement about the fact that she said that to you after a show.
She
Because,
didn't just say it. She
right,
never had me on the show again.
okay,
And
CBC should address
when
that
she
with
was in the host chair, and I used to joke about it with other co-hosts, I'd say, "Thank God Terry Malevsky would sometimes guest host," and I'd say, "Terry, thank you. I can't get on the show anymore unless you're guest hosting." And he said, "Yeah, I know, but we're having you on the show." I only can say that now because I think Terry's pretty retired. It wasn't a secret that I was blacklisted on Power and Politics.
But so if our Canadian publicly funded broadcaster has a host that, to your story, makes those kinds of decisions, that erodes the trust in the public broadcaster at a time when we need them funded and putting out fact-based local information more than ever. So I really hope that what happened years ago can get dealt with now in some sort of a way that clarifies for Canadians how CBC books their shows, whether or not they are equitable in terms of the guests, and what would be the criteria. Because Elizabeth, we're not in a position where, and I hesitated about getting into this with you because I don't want to further erode the trust in the CBC, but trust is earned, you
And
know?
also, I'm really fond of Rosie as I thought we were friends before this all happened because you sometimes think journalists are your friends, you get along well, you chat after the show, you chat before the
Sure,
show.
sure.
You're human beings, you ask about how their families are, that kind of thing. So I regret very much even talking about it with you because I'd love to patch things up, but there's
Yeah.
never been that opening. Maybe this creates that opening.
Well, I hope
But I
so.
will say there is something out there in social media called the 30-second rule. Now,
Okay.
people may not have time to look at every source. And one of the things you mentioned the places that women from Mississippi and so on. It's not for nothing that Donald Trump is now signing executive orders to get rid of the U.S. Department of Education. The right-wing agenda in the U.S. has for years. It's not overnight that they've pulled this off. A real destruction of the threat to permanently destroy democracy in the United States did not happen overnight.
Right.
It started with the decision of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the U.S., that journalism no longer had to be fair and balanced. They got rid of that rule under Ronald Reagan.
Mhm.
That gave rise to Fox News being able to exist as a broadcaster in the US. First, they had to change the FCC rules. This has been a steady effort, and they also, of course, had to underfund public education. Because if you have good, solid public education and an educated population, they can be thinking all the time and critical. When they read something, they think, well, that can't be right. Let me check somewhere. I think Canadians have a huge advantage in this disinformation war in the quality of our public education and the education and the critical thinking skills of Canadians. I'm not going to oversell it. I'm not going to say that we don't fall victim to hooey and propaganda that comes from an unreliable source.
Yeah.
We're vulnerable, but we're much more likely, to have that back of your mind thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like it could be true.
Well, I hope so.
Let me,
Yeah, so let me just ask, I just want to follow up because I
yeah,
pushed back on you about that idea of check three reliable sources, and then we got back into why CBC needs to be reliable and needs to build trust in this moment. And I hope they get better funded. But here's the thing that I say to people. It comes in so fast and furious, and there's so much of it. And checking reliable sources and getting through the mud is, I think, hard for most people, let alone people who do this for a living. So I just say, who benefits from you believing it? Just who benefits from you believing this story? Just look at that. And if it's Trump, if it's MAGA, if it's Elon Musk, if it's some sort of agenda or entity that is against your interests as a Canadian, then it might be propaganda. And that's what I've been saying. I've been putting out how to check propaganda guides on all my social platforms because that critical thinking piece is not being taught in school, Elizabeth.
I know.
I have to say to my kids, who benefits from you believing that? And then decide whether or not you're going to trust the source. That's the only thing I can think of to do, in a millisecond.
Well, it's a good question, and those of us who are still addicted to where we can find it on TV somewhere, Murder, She Wrote. Okay, where's motive? Where's opportunity? Who benefits? Is a very good question. But the other, is this plausible? The number of things that I've had, and when my constituents write me and tell me things that are simply not true, I take the time because I don't. One thing we should never do is be dismissive or attack someone for their belief in something that they think is a reliable source, but just to prompt and prod and say, does it seem at all likely? I mean, one of those ones that was out there forever was that the World Health Organization was going to force Canada to sign a treaty that would mean that decision making about Canadian healthcare would be made by some international globalist agenda. And I said, do you think any country would sign on to that? Look at the countries that are negotiating. This is an agreement to share information and make sure in the next global pandemic, because there's going to be another global pandemic, that we're working together as much as possible, sharing information across boundaries. I mean, in the beginning of COVID in Canada, we had provinces that didn't want to share information with Health Canada. That's why Health Canada, for the longest time, couldn't tell us what the infection rate was on COVID because what some provinces just didn't want to share the information. The collection of data across this country has improved a lot since COVID, but you probably remember some provinces collected data hard copy and had to fax information to Health Canada for it to be entered into computers so that you could end up coming to a conclusion. We've improved a lot. Data collection and data sharing is key in saving lives if you're in a pandemic. We've made lots of progress on that and doing it globally. The World Health Organization surely made many early mistakes in the COVID pandemic, but the US has now pulled out of the World Health Organization. I don't know how many people watching here are Rotarians, but Rotary globally has done so much work on Polio Plus to get rid of polio globally, to eradicate it. And the partner in that, of course, is the World Health Organization. So here's Trump pulling most of the budget, because World Health Organization's budget mostly came from the US. So you're going to have World Health Organization with less resources, fewer resources, and more people having bought into the notion that that's a good thing. Because you get someone like Leslie Lewis in the House of Commons, and I know Leslie and we get along fine, but she and sponsoring a petition doesn't mean a person is in favor of it, by the way. But I think she actually is in favor of Canada pulling out of the United Nations. Again, we've got to stop, check, and think, and check the sources and think, what would the world do if we didn't have the ability to sit down and diplomatically, because the place is full of diplomats, talk to each other when it feels like things are spinning out of control. It's essential that we have international law, respect the rule of law, respect trade agreements, which Trump doesn't, respect global peace accords, which Trump doesn't, respect climate agreements, which Trump doesn't. These are essential elements for a livable world for our kids.
I was just finished watching the Netflix series The Diplomat, and it was put together prior to this regime, and all the rules are being broken, all the conventions are being broken. They are, in my opinion, already in a constitutional crisis. Whether or not the Supreme Court has any kind of impact is something we're waiting to find out. But everything else, I mean, it's dystopic to watch it. It is terrifying to be its neighbor, and the world. I'm getting. I try very hard on this program, Elizabeth, not to have people lose faith in the possibility of coming through this crisis stronger and better, because this is a time where we need to find those resources within ourselves. And when I look at, if you see, clips of Canadians on CNN or something, the comments from around the world, I try to capture of support. That song "We Will Survive," that remake that was done for Canada, is being played in nightclubs around the world. We have multilateral respect and resources out there.
And what I discovered, and you may remember, Laura, I went down to Washington for the National Prayer Breakfast as part of Team Canada. One of the things that I love about the fact that the Prime Minister when Justin Trudeau convened us as all opposition party leaders about once a month after the Trump election to talk about how we could continue to send the same message. And before I went down to Washington, we actually had a phone call among all party leaders February 2nd. And I was actually on the train to Washington and with headphones and kind of hiding the screen that I was on Teams with the names of, not their faces, but we had all of us zoomed in. Anyway, I said, look, what do I say? As I don't want to be freelancing in Washington as the Green Party. I want to know, what am I saying on behalf of all of us? And the agreement was, tell them Canada is united and we will not back down. And I said, that's okay with everybody, right? Now, I think it should inspire Canadians to know that you could be on a call, as vicious as the nastiness is in Parliament, be on a call with Pierre Poilievre, Jagmeet Singh, Justin Trudeau, Yves-François Blanchet. We all say, okay, they said, yes. I said, I can say that on behalf of everyone, right? Yes, right. Now, after I attended the formal things, I went and met with congressmen and senators, and I mostly met with Republicans and their staff, and our embassy's been doing a wonderful job. Not any of the people with whom I met thought for 1 minute that the northern border of the United States with Canada was broken, or that drugs or illegal immigrants were flooding across the borders. They all knew that was nonsense and a pretext for the tariffs, and they were all nervous and keeping their heads down. But when I heard from more than one person, and mostly Democrats, honestly, thank you, tell people back in Canada, thank you, because Trump is a bully, and it looks like Canada's the only country standing up to him, and it means a lot. And that's where I think Canadians can draw extra pride when we sing, Oh Canada. We're not just as a country, Team Canada, trying to protect our economy, our workers, and our communities, although that's our prime incentive. We're trying to protect the world. We're trying to protect international law. We're trying to protect Ukraine. We're trying to protect Denmark. We're standing up for Panama. We're standing up for Mexico. We're standing up for poor and disenfranchised and vulnerable people and trans kids wherever they are, because this is a scary time, but it's particularly scary if you're in one of the groups that's already, or a country that's going to have less clout to stand up. We're a G7 country. And as you say, we have respect around the world. So when our prime minister, whoever it is, stands up and says, we're united here in Canada, and we are, and we're going to take the steps we need to take to protect ourselves, which we can, which I actually, on the hopeful side of the ledger, Laura, I think will actually strengthen our economy and make us a different kind of economy that's more self-reliant, more self-sufficient, and with, get rid of the interprovincial trade barriers. There's lots to this answer. We can actually be better off at the end of this. And with deep irony, I say perhaps in the end, we'll thank Donald Trump for waking us up to some of the things that we've been relatively negligent about improving in Canadian economic productivity, etc. But we are not just saying no to a bully. For us and for all women, I sometimes feel like Trump seems to think that Greenland is like that woman he wanted to get on a date by taking to shop the expensive furniture first, or cornering in the dressing room. When Doug Ford put on the Canada's not for sale hat, I thought, I don't think Trump thinks we're for sale. I think he thinks he can just grab us by the. Mm, he's not someone who's who's understandable in the normal frame in which you put world leaders.
Right.
He's understandable as a wannabe dictator who never wants to see another election in the United States, believe what he says, and know that the U.S. Constitution itself is in real danger, and that we have to be really good neighbors and friends to individual and Americans, to subnational governments who are really also reeling and shell-shocked by what they're seeing coming out of the White House.
It is very difficult. I listen to the news around the world in the morning, and Elizabeth, preparing for this program as well today, it's like listening to a horror movie, like from the future, or something that I might have seen in the 80s that was, the worst case scenario. But it's real and it's happening in live time. I will not step foot in that country until things change dramatically, because it does not feel safe. I mean, the UK is putting out travel warnings now about going to the US, right? And so this moment of those multilateral relationships, we're hosting the G7 in
Yes.
Alberta. And we have the Premier of Alberta talking about separatist stuff, right? Like this better happen or else. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, this is what I'm worried about. We did, Jonathan Pedno and I did a press conference on I guess it was Monday, was Monday, March 11th, or was Monday, March 10th? Well, around there, we did a press conference on how do we maintain this wonderful Team Canada spirit that we've had since
Yeah.
November 5th,
Yeah.
when Trump and the presidential election took place. And he began as president-elect saying, I'm going to apply these tariffs. I'm going to hit Canada. Canada's not been a good, I mean, what? Canada's not been a good neighbor? Really? Anyway, our defense commitments to the United States, that we co-manage NORAD, that we're there, that our soldiers fought side by side with theirs in Afghanistan. It's unbelievable, the disrespect. But leaving that aside, we as a country stand for decency. We stand for compassion and caring. And this is a moment when we need to pull together. And in an election, this is the big concern and why we held the press conference we held. What happens to Team Canada when Elon Musk can get hold of any viral clip of any one of the leaders? I'm not going to pick on one more than the others. So saying basically in an attack ad or in an unguarded moment, the other leader's mother wears army boots and blah, 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 and they eat kittens, something awful, right? And it goes, and they make it, they pump it up and they make it go viral. I don't put it past for 1 minute Trump using divide and conquer tactics, trying to create, and because basically the convoy movement was initially funded by US Republicans, the idea that trucks could take over a downtown core. I'm firmly convinced that the Ottawa convoy, as many good people and people in my riding thought it was a wonderful thing. I had some people in my community who actually felt it was on a scale like Woodstock of people power. Setting that aside, the evidence is, I think this was ground zero for a test. Can a bunch of trucks occupy a major capital city and bring a government down? After Ottawa, it was New Zealand. It was why Jacinda Ardern had to leave as Prime Minister of New Zealand. It was funded through US Republicans and it was promoted heavily by Russia Today. Russia Today as a network carried more stories about the Ottawa Freedom Convoy than any other network around the world. Now, this is all stuff we can, pull out. I can prove it if people want it, if you want me to send sources in later. But I don't put it past Trump or Musk for a minute to exploit any divisions that we open up during an election and start trying to promote a new separatist movement for the very, 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 very small percentage of Canadians who think being a 51st state sounds like a good idea. And we know it's a tiny minority. But to weaponize that, to create social media echo chambers, and to encourage people to take steps to move towards that. And that's why also that's another reason Greens are calling for a civil defense effort, because we have to be ready for even our friends and neighbors locally falling prey to stories that aren't true. We have to be able to talk to each other. We always have to hang tight to the reality that above everything else, we're Canadians, and we have to talk to each other and not shout at each other.
Well, they've already started that campaign. I mean, you've already seen them weighing in on the federal election. Trump did a major Fox interview the other night with Laura Ingraham, where he talked about Carney and Poilievre. We've seen Elon Musk promote Poilievre's interview with Peterson. We've seen Elon Musk talk promotionally about Poilievre. I mean, we know where their preferences lie. They are not being subtle, Elizabeth. And
no, but when Trump says he prefers a liberal, who thinks that's not, oh, I got a good idea. We'll say we prefer a liberal so that we can, because we know that if we endorse Poilievre, that's the kiss of death for Poilievre. So we don't want to do that to Poilievre. So we'll say, I mean, it's like it's reverse psychology. And why would anyone believe any words coming out of Trump's mouth on anything?
Exactly. So the campaign is already started for those of you who are not as much in the social media swamp as I live. It is absolutely going the 51st state thing. I get it all day. I fight it all day long. But the key is what you just said, Elizabeth, is that in times of where the air war is so full of fog, it's about talking to neighbors, to friends, to family, every chance you get. Don't hide from the political conversation. Have it respectfully, have it with love, have it with clarity. Listen to what they believe, ask them where they heard that from, talk to them about Canadian sovereignty. And what I have been finding in my conversations, even with strangers and with friends, is once you get through it, after a half an hour, it's kind of like, so we're all in agreement though, right? That protecting Canada's sovereignty is our key consideration going into this federal election. And the answer is yes, right? So beyond the partisanship, that is the uniting narrative in this country. And you are right. If this campaign gets any messier and any dirtier, it is going to be used to divide our house so that we fall. So are you willing? I was talking to one of my friends and clients prior to this, and I said, what would you ask Elizabeth May? Because they were very excited for this show. And their question was, what would you first of all think that partisanship should take a second seat to national unity? And secondly, do you think that we're going to see a rise in direct democracy, like we're starting to see in the US, where people are going to bypass their representatives to say we need to be better governed, we need to have better systems?
Well, what I love our system of government, which is not the U.S. system. It's ironic, of course. It's all. I mean, I give way too many talks in schools about trying to make history and our system of government really interesting for kids because I wish we had better civics programs through public education, K to 12. But the U.S. the American Revolution is a thing, and their system of government is totally different from ours. And ours is Westminster parliamentary democracy. And I think it's great. And I really love it. We don't directly elect a president. And most Canadians were so influenced by really, movies that we love. Like I love Kevin Kline and Dave, and I love watching, American President, never mind. But when you have a Canadian stand up and pound on the podium and say, and I'm running for prime minister, you think, oh God, please don't do that because that's Hollywood. And this is Ottawa, and nobody runs for prime minister. True. If the Greens have more seats than anyone else, Jonathan Pedno and I will figure out how we split the time in the Prime Minister's office. By the way, the Prime Minister's office isn't a thing in our Constitution. The Greens always call for cutting the Prime Minister's office budget in half, but that's just a start. There's no reason. Back in the day, by the way, when Lester B. Pearson was Prime Minister, I actually knew his principal secretary. Not then, much, much, much later. I got to know Tom Kent. And he said the prime minister's office, when it was Lester B. Pearson, was, in his words, a handful of file clerks and a stenographer. And now it's hundreds of operatives who control what their ministers do and say and what their HMP does and says. Regardless of who's in the prime minister's office, it needs to be way scaled back. Yeah. But to your point about what would I be willing to do, Jonathan and I have written all the other leaders and said, look, we need to show Team Canada through an election. How can we do that? We'd like to meet. We've asked the Prime Minister for a meeting the way we were having once a month before the Liberal leadership changeover. We'd like to explore, could we have the equivalent of what Mackenzie King did in Canada, what Winston Churchill did in the UK, of during a time when you've really got to focus on an external threat, an internal war cabinet. Now, might not want to call it the war cabinet because we're not actually at war, but we could call it a Canada-U.S. relations internal cabinet. It would have to have multi-party engagement because the other risk, besides the fact that in an election campaign, people say nasty things about each other, on top of that, effective cabinet government in response to Trump can't happen. Since November 5th until now, our cabinet has been functioning. Ministers have been acting. Retaliatory tariffs have been put in place. New policies have been launched because cabinet government in Canada can do a lot. But during an election, the convention is it's a caretaker government only. What do you do when you've got an external threat, new things coming at you, and your civil service knows that you're not supposed to do anything that isn't caretaker government? So I think we need to have a cabinet, an internal cabinet committee that has the clout and by reason of being multi-party, the legitimacy to take action to defend Canada, even during an election. If Mark Carney could put that in place, I think about how that could happen. I think about it in detail, but it could be done. It would be outside the box thinking, but if we're not prepared to think out the box in our current multi-crisis situation, I think Canadians would be grateful, so grateful to know that when we say we stand guard for thee, we've actually figured out a way that our government can function as Team Canada, despite the fact that out on the hustings, we're trying to kill each other. We all recognize as party leaders, country first, party second. That has to be what's in our head every day, or we're really vulnerable to Trump divide and conquer and Musk and Zuckerberg and all these um, oligarch billionaire pirates. We have to be prepared.
Very well said. And Elizabeth May, that is why not only people love to listen to you, and I love to just have you on here, and wherever it goes, because it's always important information for this country. But as someone said to me on social media, you've always been elbows up for Canada. You've always been fighting the good fight. And I love that idea of Canadians knowing not only maybe that we need a civil defense league to start to prepare for all these crises, these poly crises, but also that we should have some sort of a U.S. Canada cabinet, relations cabinet going during this election. There is a lot out there. A lot of it is garbage. A lot of it is going to be mis and disinformation. Super, super important as Canadians that we work together, that we stand up strong for our country. I can't think of a more important moment in our history than what's going to be happening over the next month and a half. So please vote, encourage people to vote, encourage people to highly invest, because we've seen what happened to our neighbors. Many of them didn't vote, and many of them regret their votes now because they just simply weren't informed. The price of eggs has gone up 53% or something since last year, and it's not getting better for them. So please get fully educated. And this is an incredible time for our country. Last word to you, Elizabeth May. What would you leave our audience with and our audience internationally?
Oh, Laura, first, I know I give too long answers. You're very kind to let me prattle on. I'm I love this country so much, and I love Canadians for the spirit of resilience that we're showing. The ability to say, okay, we see this. We see you, Donald. You're a bully and a wannabe dictator, and you're even referring to yourself now as king. Get over yourself. We're Canadians. We leave no one behind. We're a country that takes care of our neighbors. That's why we have universal health care. And in the US, it's every man for himself or every child for themselves. We believe in taking care of each other and building our economy to be stronger and more resilient, and we have to stay united. And so, to every Canadian, I really do think high voter turnout will make a big difference in signaling to the world we're a country that loves our democracy, will fight to defend our democracy, will also fight to defend your democracy. And God bless you, President Zelensky, and all the people around the world who are living in countries under threat. While Trump cozies up with the dictators, we'll stand on the side of the people who defend democracy.
I love it. Elbows up, Elizabeth May. There you go. You are wonderful. Good luck in the election. And
Thank you.
Canadians count on always your clarity and honesty to help us know what's going on with our country. And I'm sure our listeners around the world do as well. Be well, and we'll have you back on the OShow soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. Take care.
And thank you, all of you who watch and listen. Subscribe to the OShow. We got to keep these conversations going and make sure that we're getting the information out there. Take care. Thank you.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the OShow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the OShow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the OShow. It's the OShow. Laura Babcock's the OShow. With a lot of great guests, she puts them to the test on the OShow. There's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the OShow. Stand for something or fall for it all. Ontario, hear the call of the OShow. It's a podcast, the OShow. Laura Babcock's the OShow. Stay informed with the OShow, OShow.
Your merch bid.